Hello everybody, Jediwarlock here, and welcome back to another video here on the channel. I know it's been a few weeks since I last posted, and that's because I've been on an awesome vacation across the US, but now I'm back and ready to get back to making videos. Today, we are returning to the world of Azeroth for episode 2 of the WoW Rocks series, where I look into some of the most geographically interesting areas of the game map and examine them from a geologic perspective. I will be referencing a few things we talked about in the last video, but it's not required to still understand what's going on here. In this episode, I want to investigate Thousand Needles, a zone in World of Warcraft Classic that is definitely one of the less traveled. While not the largest zone, there are some very unique environments that aren't seen anywhere else in the game, and I want to share them with you all today. I'll be looking at the real-life inspirations behind the zone, going into a bit more detail about some notable areas, and compiling the evidence to see how, geologically, the land of 1,000 Needles came to be. So, with all that being said, let's get right into it and explore the World of Warcraft. The most defining characteristic of Thousand Needles is, well, the needles themselves. But what actually are these spires of rock? And did the developers draw any real-life inspiration from these places? My answer would be most definitely. The larger buttes, towering above the bottom of the canyon, resemble the extraordinary butte formation of Devil's Tower, or maybe the redder buttes in Monument Valley, Utah. The smaller spires resemble what are known as hoodoos, which usually form from wind eroding sedimentary rock. Some of the most famous hoodoo formations can be found in Bryce Canyon National Park, also in Utah. The final piece of this geologic puzzle is the canyon the needles are found within, which is deep, dry, and dusty, bearing a remarkable resemblance to the real-life Grand Canyon, located in Arizona. There is no other area in Classic WoW that gives players the experience of dropping down into a canyon, in the case of Thousand Needles, sometimes quite dramatically. But Thousand Needles is actually not all about buttes and canyons. In the far east of the zone, the magnificent shimmering flats can be found, which I'll explain more about soon. But for now, I think it's fairly obvious this gigantic salt bed draws inspiration from famous real-life locations such as the Bonneville Salt Flats near Salt Lake City, Utah, and the Uyuni Salt Flats in Bolivia, which are the largest in the world. Truly an impressive vista on Earth, and in Azeroth, as there really isn't anything else quite like it in the game. Let's go ahead and do a deep dive on the shimmering flats and a few other spots within the zone. Dry, salty earth greets you as you navigate out of the rocky canyon onto the shimmering flats. Here, there is little water and even less vegetation, with just the vast expanse of salt populated by a variety of creatures offering company to explorers in this area. The one exception in this lonely landscape is the Mirage Raceway, located in the middle of the flats, where the gnomes and goblins compete against one another to create the fastest rocket cars. Their racetrack loops around the perimeter of the flats, giving racers something of a tour of the unique environment. Looking at the cliffside of the basin reveals even more of a geologic record in the rock, as the salt deposits indicate there was probably a lake or bay here with a water level that rose much higher than the flats in the distant past. Moving clockwise around the map, we encounter a shipwreck buried in the ground, providing more concrete evidence, if there wasn't enough already, that some body of water was once here. Nearby is Weasel's crater, where I suspect some unfortunate racer created the explosion that reached all the way down to the water table. The southern edge of the raceway is home to the Tahonda ruins, which contain the other small water source in the region. Past where the passage into Teneris lies, the Rustmaul dig site is the final main point of interest on this circuit, and is also one of the most enigmatic. If this salt flat was once underwater, then why are there ancient ruins here? I have a few ideas that I'll explain in the next section, but for now, all you need to know is that they are there, and dwarves were very interested in their excavation before their untimely demise. Now, this area isn't explicitly named within the game, but considering this is a hot springs in the middle of the Dark Cloud Pinnacle, to me, this name makes sense. There are some unhappy water elementals here, but the real excitement is the geologic significance of this feature. In the middle of Thousand Needles, one of the driest and water-scarce zones in the entire game, there is a hot springs pool here, which indicates some sort of tectonic activity in this zone, both currently and probably also in the past. Additionally, where geysers are present, a complex network of underground reservoirs and tunnels also usually exists, which took time and geologic processes to form the right conditions for said geysers. While it might not look like much at the surface, this simple hot springs gives us great insight into how geology can be interpreted within this zone. As we talked about in the last video, the Sundering greatly changed the world of Azeroth 10,000 years ago, and since then, many zones have continued to evolve and change due to geologic processes. I believe this combination of both catastrophic and gradual change is responsible for the current state of Thousand Needles that we know in classic WoW. I make the differentiation between classic and retail WoW here because, as many players know, Thousand Needles ends up looking like this in later expansions to the game, which isn't exactly where we're starting out from. Anyway, the Wowpedia article on Thousand Needles actually gives us a lot of information about the history of the region, which lines up pretty well with the visual clues present in-game. Most of this information is derived from the WoW role-playing game guide, which is considered non-canon, but for the sake of this video, I think the history on geology will still be useful. According to the lore, the region of Thousand Needles was a river canyon, the spires of sandstone shaped from years of rushing water. Water flowed to the sea from a large lake to the east, fed by an underground tributary. Then came the demons and the destruction that threw the entire world into upheaval. The canyon was thrust above the water table, the eastern lake dried into a vast salt flat, and Thousand Needles became a sandy gorge. I have two objections with this explanation, the first being mention of an underground tributary to the sea, and the second being the first use of the word lake. As we've established, the lake that once lied on the salt flat was, well, salty, and since it's very unlikely for a lake that is fed by freshwater rivers and drains into an ocean to remain salty, I think it is much more probable that this lake was originally a bay or inlet of the Great Sea itself. During the Sundering, this bay would be landlocked by the eastern cliffs we see today, creating the salty lake that slowly dried up once the inflow rivers had been disrupted. With regard to the needle spires of the zone, one theory online stated that they could have been contained within the inlet of the sea, with the tops of them being islands, much like we see them in-game after the Cataclysm. At first, I didn't give this idea much consideration, but when you think of a zone like Dustwallow Marsh, which has a large inlet populated with lots of small islands, it actually starts to make more sense. Back then, the islands would have been in a much more shallow environment, which would get considerably deeper as one moved into the actual bay, and then, eventually, out to sea. After the Sundering, the Needles part of the inlet, now a lake, would have been the first to become even more shallow as the water retreated to the bay. It makes sense that whatever rivers from nearby Feralus were feeding into the inlet would now flow farther in order to reach the bay, meaning the Needles would essentially become a river network for some time before drying up completely. This would make sense as the erosion from both water and wind would continue to deepen the crevasses and develop the buttes into towering monoliths as the lake dried up, until the canyon and the dry salt bed were all that remained. To my knowledge, this is the best explanation of the history of this zone, using both real-life references and the online lore. But if you have other ideas, feel free to leave them down in the comments. And that brings us back to the cherry on top, those ancient ruins sitting at the bottom of the lake bed. As we saw in episode 1 of this series, dark green architecture, dwarves digging around the area, and hey, even a giant sculpted head laying in the ground are all indicative of one group, the Titans. Now, I hope this series doesn't turn into a big case of me waving everything away as, it was Titans. But in this case, I think there is satisfactory proof. The biggest hurdle I had to investigate was the fact that these ruins would be underwater in the distant past. Why would the Titans have constructed a base underwater? Well, it turns out there's an actual explanation for this in-game, and it all goes back to somewhere we've seen in this series before, Sholazar Basin. As we've established, the Titans were a group of gods who existed on Azeroth along with their servants to watch over and monitor nature and life. In Sholazar Basin, there is an active Titan facility called the Maker's Perch, which sits on the upper northwest cliff of the zone. Amazingly, checking out the inside of this base reveals an observation window looking out of the zone into the nearby North Sea, meaning part of the base indeed exists underwater as part of the Titan's surveying process. It's not entirely impossible that one of these underwater lookouts could have existed in Thousand Needles in the distant past. If the dried lakebed was once in fact an inlet of the Great Sea, it would provide the Titans with a convenient look into the life and ecology of the ocean, a microcosm of what would have been going on elsewhere in the oceans of Azeroth. Plus, with the dig site's close proximity to other Titan bases, including Ungoro Crater, Uldum, and Silithus, it seems logical the Titans would create a nearby outpost where they could survey aquatic life. And with that, we answer the question of the Rustmaul dig site and why a bunch of Titan ruins are sitting on the bottom of an old lake. Next time you're walking or falling through Thousand Needles, maybe you'll look at this often overlooked zone in a different way. It has bugged me for a long time that these ancient ruins were just placed here on top of an old lake bed, but I think we came to a pretty satisfying backstory for them today, along with the rest of the zone's geologic features. Thank you all so much for watching this episode of WoW Rocks. If you enjoyed it, make sure to like the video, comment down below with your thoughts, subscribe to join the Jedi Order, and until next time, peace.